Chapter 3. The whole night was spent in agitation. Next day, Ordunov went out early in the morning, in spite of his weakness and the fever that still hung about him. In the yard he met the porter again. This time the Tatar lifted his cap to him from a distance and looked at him with curiosity. Then, as though pulling himself together, he set to work with his broom, glancing askance at Ordunov as the latter slowly approached him. "Well, did you hear nothing in the night?" asked Ordunov.
"Yes, I heard."
"What sort of man is he? Who is he?"
"Self took lodgings, self should know. Me stranger."
"Will you ever speak?" cried Ordunov, beside himself with an access of morbid irritability.
"What did me do? Your fault. You frightened the tenants. Below lives the coffin-maker. He deaf, but heard it all, and his wife deaf, but she heard, and in the next yard, far away, they heard. I go to the overseer."
"I am going to him myself," answered Ordunov, and he went to the gate.
"As you will. Self took the room." Master, stay."
Ordunov looked round. The porter touched his hat from politeness.
"Well?" "If you go, I go to the landlord."
"What?"
"Better move."
"You're stupid," said Ordunov, and was going on again.
Master, stay."
The porter touched his hat again and grinned.
"Listen, master, be not wrathful. Why persecute a poor man? It's a sin to persecute a poor man. It is not God's law, do you hear?"
"You listen too. Here, take that. Come, what is he?"
"What is he?"
"Yes."
"I'll tell you without money."
At this point, the porter took up his broom, brandished it once or twice, then stopped and looked intently, with an air of importance, at Ordunov.
"You're a nice gentleman. If you don't want to live with a good man, do as you like. That's what I say."
Then the Tatar looked at him still more expressively, and fell to sweeping furiously again. Making a show of having finished something at last, he went up to Ordunov mysteriously, and with a very expressive gesture pronounced, "This is how it is." "How? What?"
"No sense."
"What?"
"Has flown away. Yes, has flown away,"
he repeated in a still more mysterious tone.
"He is ill. He used to have a barge, a big one, and a second and a third, used to be on the Volga, and me from the Volga myself. He had a factory too, but it was burnt down, and he is off his head."
"He is mad?"
Nay, the Tatar answered emphatically. "Not mad. He is a clever man. He knows everything. He has read many books, many. He has read everything and tells others the truth. Some bring 2 rubles, 3 rubles, 40 rubles, as much as you please. He looks in a book, sees and tells the whole truth. And the money's on the table at once. Nothing without money."
At this point the Tatar positively laughed with glee, throwing himself into Murin's interests with extreme zest. "Why, does he tell fortunes? Prophesy?"
Muttered the porter, wagging his head quickly. "He tells the truth. He prays a great deal. It's just that way, comes upon him."
Then the Tatar made his expressive gesture again. At that moment, someone called the porter from the other yard, and then a little, bent, gray-headed man in a sheepskin appeared. He walked, stumbling and looking at the ground, groaning and muttering to himself. He looked as though he were in his dotage.
The
The master!" the porter whispered in a fluster, with a hurried nod to Ordunov, and taking off his cap, he ran to meet the old man, whose face looked familiar to Ordunov. He had anyway met him somewhere just lately. Reflecting, however, that there was nothing remarkable in that, he walked out of the yard. The porter struck him as an out-and-out rogue and an impudent fellow. "The scoundrel is practically bargaining with me," he thought. "Goodness knows what it means." He had reached the street as he said this. By degrees he began to be absorbed in other thoughts. The impression was unpleasant. The day was gray and cold. Flakes of snow were flying. The young man felt overcome by a feverish shiver again. He felt, too, as though the earth were shaking under him. All at once, an unpleasantly sweet, familiar voice wished him good morning in a broken tenor. "Yaroslav Ilyich," said Ordunov. Before him stood a short, sturdy, red-cheeked man, apparently about 30, with oily gray eyes and a little smile, dressed as Yaroslav Ilyich always was dressed. He was holding out his hand to him in a very amicable way. Ordunov had made the acquaintance of Yaroslav Ilyich just a year before, in quite a casual way, almost in the street. They had so easily become acquainted, partly by chance and partly through Yaroslav Ilyich's extraordinary propensity for picking up everywhere good-natured, well-bred people, and his preference for friends of good education whose talents and elegance of behavior made them worthy at least of belonging to good society. Though Yaroslav Ilyich had an extremely sweet tenor, yet even in conversation with his dearest friends there was something extraordinarily clear, powerful, and dominating in the tone of his voice that would put up with no evasions. It was perhaps merely due to habit. "How on earth?" exclaimed Yaroslav Ilyich with an expression of the most genuine, ecstatic pleasure. "I am living here." "Have you lived here long?" Yaroslav Ilyich continued on an ascending note. "And I did not know it. Why, we are neighbors. I am in this quarter now. I came back from the Ryazan province a month ago. I've caught you, my old and noble friend." And Yaroslav Ilyich laughed in a most good-natured way. "Sergeyev," he cried impressively, "wait for me at Tarasov's, and don't let them touch a sack without me. And stir up the Olsufiev porter. Tell him to come to the office at once. I shall be there in an hour." Hurriedly giving someone this order, the refined Yaroslav Ilyich took Ordunov's arm and led him to the nearest restaurant. "I shall not be satisfied till we have had a couple of words alone after such a long separation. Well, what of your doings?" he pronounced almost reverently, dropping his voice mysteriously. "Working at science as ever?" "Yes, as before," answered Ordunov, struck by a bright idea. "Splendid, Vassily Mihalich, splendid!" At this point Yaroslav Ilyich pressed Ordunov's hand warmly. "You will be a credit to the community. God give you luck in your career. Goodness, how glad I am I met you! How often I have thought of you! How often I have said, 'Where is he, our good, noble-hearted, witty Vassily Mihalich?'" They engaged a private room. Yaroslav Ilyich ordered lunch, asked for vodka, and looked feelingly at Ordunov. "I have read a great deal since I saw you," he began in a timid and somewhat insinuating voice. "I have read all Pushkin." Ordunov looked at him absent-mindedly. "A marvelous understanding of human passion. But first of all, let me express my gratitude. You have done so much for me by nobly instilling into me a right way of thinking." "Upon my word." "No, let me speak. I always like to pay honor where honor is due. and I am proud that this feeling at least has found expression. Really, you are unfair to yourself, and I, indeed— No, I am quite fair, Yaroslav Ilyich replied with extraordinary warmth. What am I in comparison with you? Good heavens! Yes. Then followed silence. Following your advice, I have dropped many low acquaintances, and have to some extent softened the coarseness of my manners. Yaroslav Ilyich began again in a somewhat timid and insinuating voice. In the time when I am free from my duties, I sit for the most part at home. In the evenings I read some improving book, and I have only one desire, Vassily Mihalich, to be of some little use to the fatherland. I have always thought you a very high-minded man, Yaroslav Ilyich. You always bring balm to my spirit, you generous young man. Yaroslav Ilyich pressed Ordinov's hand warmly. You are drinking nothing? He said, his enthusiasm subsiding a little. I can't. I'm ill. Ill? Yes, are you really? How long, in what way did you come to be ill? If you like, I'll speak— What doctor is treating you? If you like, I'll speak to our parish doctor. I'll run round to him myself. He's a very skilful man. Yaroslav Ilyich was already picking up his hat. Thank you very much. I don't go in for being doctored. I don't like doctors. You don't say so. One can't go on like that. But he's a very clever man, Yaroslav Ilyich went on imploringly. The other day— Do allow me to tell you this, dear Vassily Mihalich. The other day a poor carpenter came. Here, said he, I hurt my hand with a tool, cure it for me. Semyon Pafnutyich, seeing that the poor fellow was in danger of gangrene, set to work to cut off the wounded hand. He did this in my presence, but it was done in such a in such a superb way, that I confess if it had not been for compassion for suffering humanity, it would have been a pleasure to look on, simply from curiosity. But where and how did you fall ill? In moving from my lodging. I've only just got up. But you are still very unwell, and you ought not to be out. So you are not living where you were before? But what induced you to move? My landlady was leaving Petersburg. Domna Savishna, really, a thoroughly estimable, good-hearted woman. Do you know, I had almost a son's respect for her. That life, so near its end, had something of the serene dignity of our forefathers, and looking at her, one seemed to see the incarnation of our hoary-headed, stately old traditions. I mean of that— something in it so poetical— Yaroslav Ilyich concluded, completely overcome with shyness and blushing to his ears. Yes, she was a nice woman. But allow me to ask you where you are settled now. Not far from here, in Koshmarov's buildings. I know him, a grand old man. I am, I may say, almost a real friend of his, a fine old veteran. Yaroslav Ilyich's lips almost quivered with enthusiasm. He asked for another glass of vodka and a pipe. Have you taken a flat? No, a furnished room in a flat. Who is your landlord? Perhaps I know him too. Murin, an artisan, a tall old man. Murin. Yes, in the back court, over the coffin-makers, allow me to ask. Yes, in the back court. Are you comfortable there? Yes, I've only just moved in. I only meant to say— Have you noticed nothing special? Really? That is, I am sure you will be quite all right there if you are satisfied with your quarters. I did not mean that. I am ready to warn you, but knowing your character— How did that old artisan strike you? He seems to be quite an invalid. Yes, he's a great sufferer. But have you noticed nothing? Have you talked to him? Very little. He is so morose and unsociable. Yaroslav Ilyich mused. He's an unfortunate man, he said dreamily. Is he? Yes, unfortunate, and at the same time an incredibly strange and interesting person. However, if he does not worry you... Excuse my dwelling upon such a subject, but I was curious. And you have really roused my curiosity too. I should very much like to know what sort of man he is. Besides, I am living with him. You know, they say the man was once very rich. He traded, as most likely you have heard. But through various unfortunate circumstances he was reduced to poverty. Many of his barges were wrecked in a storm and lost, together with their cargo. His factory, which was, I believe, in the charge of a near and dear relation, was equally unlucky and was burnt down, and the relation himself perished in the flames. It must be admitted it was a terrible loss. Then, so they say, Murin sank into tearful despondency. They began to be afraid he would lose his reason, and indeed in a quarrel with another merchant, also an owner of barges plying on the Volga, he suddenly showed himself in such a strange and unexpected light that the whole incident could only be accounted for on the supposition that he was quite mad, which I am prepared to believe. I have heard in detail of some of his queer ways. There suddenly happened at last a very strange, so to say momentous, circumstance which can only be attributed to the malign influence of wrathful destiny. What was it? Asked Ordunov. They say that in a fit of madness he made an attempt on the life of a young merchant, of whom he had before been very fond. He was so upset when he recovered from the attack that he was on the point of taking his own life. So at least they say. I don't know what happened after that, but it is known that he was several years doing penance. But what is the matter with you, Vassily Mihailitch? Am I fatiguing you with my artless tale? Oh, no, for goodness' sake. You say that he has been doing penance, but he is not alone. I don't know. I am told he was alone. Anyway, no one else was mixed up in that affair. However, I have not heard what followed. I only know... Well, I only know... That is, I had nothing special in my mind to add. I only want to say, if you find anything strange or out of the ordinary in him, all that is merely the result of the misfortunes that have descended upon him, one after the other. Yes, he is so devout, so sanctimonious. I don't think so, Vassily Mihailitch. He has suffered so much. I believe he is quite sincere. But now, of course, he is not mad. He is all right. Oh, yes, I can answer for that. I am ready to take any oath on it. He is in full possession of all his faculties. He is only, as you have justly observed, extremely strange and devout. He is a very sensible man, in fact. He speaks smartly, boldly, and very subtly. The traces of his stormy life in the past are still visible on his face. He's a curious man and very well read. He seems to be always reading religious books. Yes, he is a mystic. What? A mystic. But I tell you that as a secret. I will tell you as a secret, too, that a very careful watch was kept on him for a time. The man had a great influence on people who used to go to him. What sort of influence? But you'll never believe it. You see, in those days he did not live in this building. Alexander Ignatievich, a respectable citizen, a man of standing, held in universal esteem, went to see him with a lieutenant out of curiosity. They arrive and are received, and the strange man begins by looking into their faces. He usually looks into people's faces if he consents to be of use to them. If not, he sends people away, and even very uncivilly, I'm told. He asks them, "What do you want, gentlemen?" "Well," answers Alexander Ignatyevich, "your gift can tell you that without our saying." "Come with me into the next room," he says. Then he signified which of them it was who needed his services. Alexander Ignatyevich did not say what happened to him afterwards, but he came out from him as white as a sheet. The same thing happened to a well-known lady of high rank. She too came out from seeing him as white as a sheet, bathed in tears and overcome with his predictions and his sayings. Strange. But now does he still do the same? It's strictly prohibited. There have been marvelous instances. A young cornet, the hope and joy of a distinguished family, mocked at him. "What are you laughing at?" said the old man, angered. "In 3 days' time you will be like this." And he crossed his arms over his bosom to signify a corpse. Well, I don't venture to believe it, but they say his prediction came true. He has a gift, Vassily Mihalich. You are pleased to smile at my guileless story. I know that you are greatly ahead of me in culture, but I believe in him. He's not a charlatan. Pushkin himself mentions a similar case in his works. I don't want to contradict you. I think you said he's not living alone? I don't know. I believe his daughter is with him. Daughter? Yes, or perhaps his wife. I know there is some woman with him. I have had a passing glimpse of her, but I did not notice. Strange. The young man fell to musing, Yaroslav Ilyich to tender contemplation of him. He was touched both at seeing an old friend and at having satisfactorily told him something very interesting. He sat sucking his pipe with his eyes fixed on Vassily Mihalich, but suddenly he jumped up in a fluster. "A whole hour has passed and I forgot the time. Dear Vassily Mihalich, once more I thank the lucky chance that brought us together, but it is time for me to be off. Will you allow me to visit you in your learned retreat?" "Please do. I shall be delighted. I will come and see you too when I have a chance." "That's almost too pleasant to believe. You gratify me unutterably. You would not believe how you have delighted me." They went out of the restaurant. Sergeyev was already flying to meet them and to report in a hurried sentence that William Emelianovitch was pleased to be driving out. A pair of spirited roans in a smart light gig did, in fact, come into sight. The trace horse was particularly fine. Yaroslav Ilyich pressed his best friend's hand as though in a vice, touched his hat, and set off to meet the flying gig. On the way he turned round once or twice to nod farewells to Ordunov. Ordunov felt so tired, so exhausted in every limb, that he could scarcely move his legs. He managed somehow to crawl home. At the gate he was met again by the porter, who had been diligently watching his parting from Yaroslav Ilyich and beckoning him from a distance. But the young man passed him by. At the door of his flat he ran full tilt against a little grey-headed figure coming out from Murin's room, looking on the ground. "Lord, forgive my transgressions," whispered the figure, skipping on one side with the springiness of a cork. "Did I hurt you?" "No, I humbly thank you for your civility. Oh, Lord, Lord!" The meek little man, groaning and moaning and muttering something edifying to himself, went cautiously down the stairs. This was the master of the house, of whom the porter stood in such awe. Only then Ordunov remembered that he had seen him for the first time here at Murin's when he was moving into the lodging. He felt unhinged and shaken. He knew that his imagination and impressionability were strained to the utmost pitch, and resolved not to trust himself. By degrees he sank into a sort of apathy. A heavy, oppressive feeling weighed upon his chest. His heart ached as though it were sore all over, and his whole soul was full of dumb, comfortless tears. He fell again upon the bed which she had made him, and began listening again. He heard two breathings, one the heavy, broken breathing of a sick man, the other soft but uneven, as though also stirred by emotion, as though that heart was beating with the same yearning, with the same passion. At times he heard the rustle of her dress, the faint stir of her soft, light steps, and even that faint stir of her feet echoed with a vague but agonizingly sweet pang in his heart. At last he seemed to distinguish sobs, rebellious sighs, and at last praying again. He knew that she was kneeling before the icon, wringing her hands in a frenzy of despair. Who was she? For whom was she praying? By what desperate passion was her heart torn? Why did it ache and grieve and pour itself out in such hot and hopeless tears? He began to recall her words. All that she had said to him was still ringing in his ears like music, and his heart lovingly responded with a vague, heavy throb at every recollection, every word of hers as he devoutly repeated it. For an instant a thought flashed through his mind that he had dreamed all this. But at the same moment his whole being ached with swooning anguish as the impression of her hot breath, her words, her kiss rose vividly again in his imagination. He closed his eyes and sank into oblivion. A clock struck somewhere. It was getting late. Twilight was falling. It suddenly seemed to him that she was bending over him again, that she was looking into his eyes with her exquisitely clear eyes, wet with sparkling tears of serene, happy joy, soft and bright as the infinite turquoise vault of heaven at hot midday. Her face beamed with such triumphant peace. Her smile was warm with such solemnity of infinite bliss. She leaned with such sympathy, with such childlike impulsiveness on his shoulder, that a moan of joy broke from his exhausted bosom. She tried to tell him something. Caressingly she confided something to him. Again it was as though heart-rending music smote upon his hearing. Greedily he drank in the air, warm, electrified by her near breathing. In anguish he stretched out his arms, sighed, opened his eyes. She stood before him, bending down to his face, all pale as from fear, all in tears, all quivering with emotion. She was saying something to him, entreating him with half-bare arms, clasping and wringing her hands. He folded her in his arms. She quivered on his bosom. Breaking in. Because I missed it on my first reading, I should mention explicitly here that Yaroslav Ilyich is a police inspector. The porter announces his intention to seek out the one he calls the overseer in response to the previous night's disturbance, and Ordunov responds that he is going to him himself. Presumably the overseer is a policeman. The various secrets and bits of gossip that Yaroslav Ilyich relates to his friend have apparently been picked up in his line of work. This chapter introduces several names, most of which may be safely ignored or forgotten. But special notice should be made of one name, Koshmarov, the owner of the building in which Ordunov is lodging. The name comes from the Russian word for nightmare. So, when Ordunov crosses the threshold, he enters the domain of bad dreams. I hope it is clear that Murin, although he is Ordunov's landlord, does not own anything. He is merely a tenant in Koshmarov's building. Of course, Koshmarov himself makes a strange appearance in this chapter, which may be significant later. Also of significance is the story Yaroslav Ilyich tells of Murin's background. We will encounter an alternative narrative in the pages ahead. End of comments.